So, good morning, welcome to this class on monosynaptic reflexes. This is part 1. So, in this class we will define, or at least we will come up with a working definition of reflexes and define what is called as a reflex arc and types of reflexes, how do we classify reflexes, and two specific classes, two specific cases of reflexes, the H reflex and the M response. Critical, the role of orthodromic and antidromic action potential travel. We have seen what these are in previous classes. I will remind them what it is in today's class and we will proceed. Okay. So, there are multiple definitions that are available for this word reflex. We need to agree on what is a working definition if we have to teach this class, if we have to learn about this topic, we need to agree what do you mean by a reflex. For now, for the purpose of this class, today's class alone, we will call that action or that movement that is nearly instantaneous to a stimulus which I cannot modulate by pure thinking, pure volition. I cannot control purely by thinking that the response has to be different. I cannot change that response. Let us take some examples. So, the common reflex that you see, for example, in physiological tests, if you go to a doctor, they do a physiological test. So, what they do is a reflex test is they tap with a little hammer and near the knee, right? Not this is called as the also we call the knee jerk response. Regardless of what the person wants to do, that is a response. That response he cannot control by pure thinking. I do not want to move my leg. If you have that this, it is possible that some of the amplitude may change, but the response may not disappear. So, for the purpose of this class, we will say that the response that I cannot control by pure thinking, we will call as reflex, and everything else is non-reflex. And again, within non-reflex there are several things. Reflexes that are falling at the edge between voluntary and non-voluntary. What is voluntary and what is reflex? We do not know the answers to this question. We still do not know. Here is a paper by brilliant scientists Arthur Prohaska, Jerry Loeb, John Rothwell and Jonathan Wolpa, who are experts in this field. As late as 2000, year 2000, they are discussing what do reflex and voluntary mean, modern views on an ancient debate. Those who are interested in this terminology and the nuances that come with this terminology, what baggage does terminology carry, in this must definitely consider reading this paper, definitely worthwhile. It is at least a good philosophical introduction to the notion of reflexes and voluntary. What if I know that, at least if I say that I know that I am going to do this, actually there is data from I think that was Libet 1984. It is a paper by Libet where he shows that before you even know that something is going to happen, the response for that action or the sequence of events for that action has already been started. Only after that you realize that this is going to happen. So, in other words, the action is already initiated and only after that you come to know that this is the action that is going to happen. So, in that case, is that particular action voluntary or not? No answers to those questions. I leave you with questions than with answers, but for now, for the purpose of this class, we will only say that if I cannot modulate a response by pure thinking, that response is a reflex for the purpose of today's class. And suddenly you are realizing you are on the road, suddenly you are realizing that there is a red light. What do? It is not like, oh, that it is not a conscious process, the light has turned red, now I must hit the brakes. It is like you know, you are automatically hitting on the brakes when you see the red light here, right, as soon as you do that, right. By the way, let us remember that, you know, there are drivers with good reflexes and then there are drivers with bad reflexes. Let us take the case of you know, a person who is putting the finger on a source of, on a hot body, on a hot object, right. When you do that, a reflex. Actually what happens is that, you know, there are pain and temperature sensitive receptors. We saw this in one of the previous classes, thermoreceptors and nociceptors. These detect the presence of heat or painful stimuli and cause some sort of, not necessarily in a simple manner, some sort of response by the muscle. You want to withdraw your fingers from the source of, or your hand from the source of heat or danger, right. This need not necessarily happen in a relatively simple loop. It may involve several processing loops, and it need not involve the brain also, it need not involve conscious thinking also. It may be that it is happening at the level of spinal cord. Okay. So, what happens is that there is the receptor information or the perceptual information that goes in blue, that is shown in blue here, that goes to the spinal cord, and some processing is happening, not shown here, is some processing of this information, and some command to withdraw is given, that is coming in red here, and a muscle to withdraw, the muscle responsible for withdrawal of the arm is activated and then the arm is withdrawn. Okay. So, this is the function that involves a perception part and an action part with the processing unit included. So, there is, so let us say this is the stimulus, there is the perceptual part or perception, then there is some sort of processing, or I am going to call the entire thing as, say, a CPU, and there is an action. Okay. This loop is also called as a reflex arc frequently in literature. Okay. So, that is what is shown here again. For example, there is a but with a particular example of the muscle getting lengthened, right. When the muscle gets lengthened, when the muscle gets stretched, what happens? We saw what will happen. There are 1A afferents and 2 afferents. This 1A afferents are responsible for detection of velocity and length, 2 is responsible for detection of length alone. So, as this muscle is getting stretched, this information goes via 1A or 2 afferents to a central processing unit. Afferent means perception, sensory. Efferent means motor, action. Okay. This central processing unit gives command to that muscle or other muscles to perform an action. Those that reflexes that involve only one synapse at the central processing unit, only one synapse at the central processing unit. Please note what that means is the one synapse is at the central processing unit. There is obviously a synapse between the efferent neuron and the muscle, that is the neuromuscular junction or the neuromuscular synapse, that is not considered as part of this discussion. That is there in all the cases, that is there in reflexes, that is there in voluntary actions, that is there in non-reflexes, that is there everywhere. So, that synapse is not considered. If there is only one synapse in the central processing unit, then the reflex is called as a monosynaptic reflex, reflex that involves only one central synapse, that is the keyword. So, actually there are two synapses, one between the perceptual neuron and the action neuron, or between the alpha motor neuron and the 1A afferent, right, and one more between the alpha motor neuron and the muscle fiber, that is a neuromuscular synapse. There are actually two, but there is only one central synapse. These reflexes are called as monosynaptic reflexes. Those cases in which there are either 2 or 3 synapses, they are called as oligosynaptic reflexes, and there are reflexes that involve many synapses, more than 3, but can still be called as reflexes. These are called as polysynaptic reflexes. And note, usually there is a time delay. How do you know how many synapses are there? You actually do not know. When you are measuring from the outside, you do not know how many synapses are there, but it turns out that the delay between the stimulus arrival and the response arrival scales as a function of the number of synapses. As the number of synapses increases, the latency, the time delay between the stimulus arrival and the response beginning increases. So that means if there is a greater latency, latency means is the delay between the stimulus and the response, just called latency, sometimes called reflex latency more precisely, right. If this latency is greater, that means that there must be a greater number of synapses. It usually scales nicely with the number of synapses. As the number of synapses increases, the latency increases to a great level. As if the latency is less, that means that the number of synapses must be less, because why is this? Let us remind ourselves what are synapses. Whenever we say synapses, by default we are talking about chemical synapses. These synapses involve release of a neurotransmitter, response by a receptor to that neurotransmitter, etc., is it not? So, that means there is a chemical transport that is involved from the outside, from the synaptic end bulb of one neuron to the receptor part of the other neuron. In the middle there is extracellular space through in which this chemical moves purely by diffusion. This is not a controlled process. This may take a finite amount of, it is not it is not going to take 0 time, it is going to take a finite amount of time, and that is not the same in all cases. So, there is some uncertainty involved in that. Okay. So, but one thing is clear, that as the latency increases, the number of synapses increases. So, that is known, very well known and well documented. Okay. So, and there is a particular case of a reflex that we need to discuss. We will just discuss it now. I will just introduce some terminology or just remind ourselves of this terminology. We said a case in which information moves from the cell body to the periphery through in the axon, right, that is called as orthodromic action potential. Okay. And in the case where the information moves from the periphery to the cell body, right, is called as antidromic action potential. A better example is the case of the proprioceptor neuron. We have seen that earlier, right? Not. These neurons have a characteristic T shaped axon. One of this branch is the perception branch, the other branch is the central branch. This branch, in the perception branch, there is a sensor at the end. This may be a Golgi tendon organ, this may be a receptor, this may be a muscle spindle 1A, 2, whatever, one of these. So, there is a sensor in the end, and the information travels from the periphery to the neuronal cell body. In that case, the movement, the conduction is called antidromic conduction. Okay. In this case, it is antidromic. Then there is a little bit of processing, a very little processing here at the cell body, and then conduction happens from the cell body through the central axon in the reaching the spinal cord. From there it goes elsewhere, right. This is called as orthodromic. This can also be seen elsewhere in the case of the reflex arc. This can also be seen there. So, now information about the muscle stretch, for example, is taken out by the 1A afferent, for example, right. In that case, first the information goes antidromically and reaches the central synapse, and actually what it does, it synapses with the alpha motor neuron and activates the alpha motor neuron that innervates the same muscle. So, let us try to analyze this situation what happens is information goes about, so the muscle is getting stretched, the muscle does not want to get stretched. Somebody is stretching my muscle, I do not want to get that muscle to be stretched, for example. Then the information about the muscle stretch goes to the proprioceptor neuron. This proprioceptor neuron activates or excites an alpha motor neuron that will contract to reduce the amount of stress. We saw several cases of negative feedback. Here is one case of negative feedback in which the proprioceptor neuron is directly requesting, directly commanding the alpha motor neuron to contract, right. When that happens, right, there is a reflex, there is a response. So, that obviously involves both orthodromic and antidromic conduction, etc. Okay. One other thing that is possible is the following: I could electrically stimulate these neurons and check response. Why is this necessary? I will discuss in future slides the applications of this modality, why this becomes necessary. Suppose I electrically stimulate neurons from the outside using a stimulator, basically applying an electrical pulse. Then what happens, because of this reason, actually there are multiple things that could happen. If the neuron that I would like to stimulate is superficial, then the chances that then the probability that I am going to be able to excite that are relatively high, but it could be deep also, and I do not know, I do not control how, at what depth outside the inside the body this particular neuron is. So, we do not control that. But one other thing that is there is the thickness of the neuron. The thickness, as the diameter of the neuron increases, if I apply a larger stimulus, it will first fire than in comparison with the smaller ones. So, this is for a pulse. So, when I apply a pulse, the largest neurons first fire, and it turns out that the largest neurons in this case are the 1A afferents. These are the thickest, they first fire. So, as soon as they fire, what happens is that even though there is no length change in the muscle, the 1A afferent starts firing. As soon as it fires, it excites the alpha motor neuron, and the alpha motor neuron causes a contraction in the muscle. So, let us suppose that I am able to sync the time of stimulus application to the response. The response I am measuring using electrodes, using EMG, using surface EMG, using surface electrodes. Okay. Let us say that the measurement or the measurement of the output and the stimulus are synced properly. In that case, I will get a delay between when the stimulus was applied and when the response arrived. I can then start studying the relationship between the characteristic of the stimulus and the characteristic of the response. Why is this important? I will soon say before the end of the class. Suppose there is a small stimulus that is applied of some strength, that stimulus, no response, nothing happens, anyway, a slight. Then I increase the stimulus strength like that, right. You see the second one, that one is a taller building when compared with that one, is it not? So, increase the stimulus strength, then what happens is a response is seen at that latency. Say for example, here is when the stimulus is applied, the latency is so much. And what is this response? This response, how is this caused? This is due to the firing of 1A afferent that activates or excites the alpha motor neuron, and the alpha motor neuron causes a muscle contraction, whose electrical activity or the local field potential of that muscle contraction is measured here. Okay. So, this is not actually measured at the neuron, this is measured at the muscle level. Okay. So, this is the output, the net output of the system that is measured at the muscle level, that happens at so much delay, some latency. Okay. Now, this reflects that is induced due to electrical stimulation is called as H reflex, attributed to a scientist called Hoffman. Okay. Nobody calls this as Hoffman reflex anymore, everybody calls this as H reflex. H reflex means is that reflex that is elicited through electrical stimulation of a muscle nerve, monosynaptic one alone, because you will soon see what happens later on. There are other things that come into the picture. The monosynaptic one that involves the 1A afferents, activation of the 1A afferent is called H reflex. Okay. And I increase the stimulus strength. So, this building is bigger than the previous building, then the response increases, and I increase the stimulus strength further, then the response increases further. So, you see that the amplitude is different, and note in all these cases the latency remains approximately the same, is it not? The latency is approximately the same in all the cases. So, that means what? That means all these reflexes have same pathways, because the latency does not change, it involves the same neurons, but the amplitude changes. So, that means something else must go on. Why? Because the number of 1A afferents that get recruited increases as a function of the stimulus strength. As I increase the stimulus strength in that way, the number of 1A afferents that get recruited increases. So, the thickest one is the thickest 1A afferent is the first one to get recruited, the next thicker one is the second one to get recruited, the next thicker one is the third one to get recruited, and so on and so forth, right. The smaller diameter fibers are actually the ones corresponding to the motor neurons. Those are relatively smaller when compared with the afferents. There must be some reason why the afferent information is carried in large diameter fibers when compared with the efferent information. Okay. And also we said in the previous class that comparison between alpha motor neuron and gamma motor neuron, alpha motor neurons are thicker and gamma motor neurons are thinner, we said that earlier. Okay. So, here these, as the number of 1A afferents that are getting recruited increases, the response keeps increasing. Note the response is the total sum of the muscle activity. So, the total muscle activity keeps increasing. So, what is measured is not an individual neurons response, but rather muscles response. Okay. But can it go forever? Can it go up forever? That is the question. The answer you can see from the picture. At some point I keep increasing the stimulus, the response decreases, response reduces, and actually at some point if it is further increased, actually at some point becomes 0, there is no more response. Why is this the case? We need to check why this is the case. But before that, there is one more thing that we need to discuss. That one more thing is something else also happens, it seems. As the stimulus strength keeps increasing, I am beginning to see a response at that latency, a smaller latency. I said earlier that the H reflex is the monosynaptic reflex, monosynaptic pathway, and that latency is so much. If I see a response at a lower latency, then there is only one possibility, that is there is no synapse in that pathway. What could be that pathway is the question. As in that the response keeps increasing, as I keep increasing the stimulus, you see that the latency remains the same, the amplitude keeps increasing, did not? Very large amplitude responses that happen at a much lower latency when compared with the H reflex. It is not clear what is the physiological, what is the mechanism of this. What happens is, I am stimulating here at this point, stimulation is applied at that point. Okay. I said the first ones to get activated are these 1A afferents. This is the alpha motor neuron, this is the motor neuronal axon. At some point the motor neuronal axon starts, or one motor neuronal axon starts getting stimulated and it conducts, causes a small contraction. Note these responses again, all these responses are EMGs, are muscle responses, these are all muscle responses, the net response of the muscle, not an individual fiber. Okay. So, it is getting stimulated in the middle of the axon, in the center of the axon. So, we said early on when we discussed action potential propagation, that if you stimulate a neuron in the middle, action potential will travel in both directions, that is what happens. So, action potential travels antidromically as well as orthodromically from the alpha motor neuron. So, this orthodromic action potential causes contraction of the muscle, which is what you are seeing here, which is what is seen here. What happens to the antidromic action potential? We need to check, something must happen to this antidromic action potential that reaches the alpha motor neuron. So, I am stimulating in the middle, it causes action potential to travel in two directions. The one that reaches the muscle causes a contraction that is observed of this response, and obviously since this distance is much greater than say that distance, is it not? The line in blue is much shorter than the line in red that I have drawn, or I am going to draw with, for the sake of clarity, the line in black. That is the loop for the H reflex. The black line is the loop for the H reflex. We said early on that the latency is actually due to multiple reasons, is not? There is a latency that is involved in the perception loop, there is a latency that is involved in the action loop, and there is a latency that is involved in the central processing loop. The sum of all these three is the total latency, that is what you are observing here. So, that is, this is the total latency, this is the total latency, whereas here the blue line is much shorter. So, the latency is also much shorter, the blue line is much shorter. So, the latency is much shorter, that is the reason you are having the response arrive pretty quickly in comparison with H reflex importantly. And I keep increasing the stimulus, I keep increasing the stimulus, the response size keeps increasing. A question is, why does the H reflex response go down? This we have not discussed. It keeps it seems like this is increasing until some point and then decreasing, okay, in the case of H reflex. Why is this happening? Why would this happen? And what happens to the antidromic action potential that is reaching to the alpha motor neuron? You see, an alpha motor neuron is an efferent neuron that only keeps giving command. It is not used to receiving command at the command giving pathway, is it not? So, this is the pathway through which command is given. For the first time some information is arriving at the alpha motor neuron. The response is dependent on several local factors. If and usually there is not any response that arrives, because this action potential arrives and gets extinguished at the axon hillock, at around that area, nothing happens usually in the, at least in the initial stimulation state. But it is possible that at some point this action potential could go and cause a new action potential to be generated in the alpha motor neuron. What will happen when that happens? What is the response? That is another thing that we will have to see. So, there are a few things that we need to discuss. One is the relationship between the size of the stimulus and the size of the H reflex. There is not a monotonic response, as you see here. Here I keep increasing the stimulus, the response size increases, a relatively monotonic response. Here it first increases and then decreases, a non monotonic response of the H reflex amplitude. This is the other thing that we need to see. Okay. So, suppose I keep applying successive stimuli at and I change the frequency at a relatively high frequency. When I do that, then what happens is that all the M responses will be of the same size, but the H reflex size reduces. Actually, if I continue this business, at some point H reflex will get extinguished. The question is, why does this happen? So, but the M response amplitude remains the same. That means that the mechanism involved in these two processes are different, fundamentally different. That is the reason why you are seeing that the M response amplitude remains approximately a constant regardless of the stimulation frequency. I keep changing the stimulation, the response, M response remains approximately the same. So, that means something must be fundamentally different. We need to check what this is. We will stop here for this class. We will continue this discussion in future. So, what we have seen so far is the definition of reflex. We said that this is a response that is almost instantaneous, that cannot be controlled by pure thinking. Reflex arc is one that involves a perception loop, an action loop, small or bigger, so, a central processing unit. And we defined, when there is only one central synapse, it is monosynaptic. When there are 2 or 3 central synapses, it is oligosynaptic. When there are many central synapses, it is polysynaptic. And we defined what is H reflex. H reflex is this reflex that is elicited in response to electrical stimulation of a muscle nerve. And M response, and we reminded ourselves of what the orthodromic and antidromic action potential are. But before we finish, we need to realize the relationship between H reflex and the knee jerk response. So, what is the knee jerk response? We said what it is. So, a person is sitting on a chair and a relatively small hammer is used to tap near the person's knee, and a jerk is caused, is it not? This response involves a monosynaptic pathway and is called as the tendon response or the T reflex. Okay. This response is elicited by mechanical perturbation of the system. I am mechanically perturbing, I am hitting with a hammer. When the same is done, when something similar is done by electrically stimulating, I get H reflex. So, that is the fundamental difference. Otherwise, the pathways are the same, the pathways involved are the pathways of the 1A afferents. Okay. So, in the next class we will see the relationship between H reflex stimulus and the response, why it produces a non-monotonic curve, what will happen if the stimulus goes to the alpha motor neuron and returns back, or will it even return back. Questions like that we will address in future classes. We will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.